Hello class, my name is Johnny Sloan. I am doing my presentation on William Faulkner and specifically his short story of barn burning. And with that short introduction, we'll get right into it. So Faulkner grew up in the South. We're looking at writers who were influenced and wrote about issues that were going on in the South in the early 1900s, and this was the case for Faulkner. He was born in 1897 near Oxford, Mississippi, and he lived there for a good while he was growing up. His family was steeped in Southern tradition. There were, he was from several generations that had grown up in that area, and even his grandfather was a local legend. He was a Civil War hero of sorts. He was a lawyer, a railroad builder, and then eventually he got shot and killed by a political rival in some kind of a squabble they were having. So there were a lot of things that went on in Faulkner's early life that really influenced his upbringing and some of the issues that he was familiar with, and probably why he wrote about some of the things he did. He dropped out of high school and really didn't have any further education than that. He went to the University of Mississippi for about a year, and he gave up on that, which sounds really negative, but honestly I think that is quite the testament to his brilliance that allowed him to write the way he did. It was just a natural God-given talent that he had to write these things. And there was one other incident when he was growing up that no doubt had a huge impact on his life. There was a lynching in his town in Oxford. It was between an accused black man who supposedly killed a white woman, and the town just got into an uproar, and they raided the jail, and they drug this man out, and they killed him. And you can imagine the commotion that went on in that. And it says, when I was reading about that, it said that Faulkner lived just a few hundred yards from where this happened at. And given him being a young boy in a small town, I'm sure that he heard the commotion and no doubt saw this. And this racial tension and things were real prevalent growing up in the South back then. And he addresses a lot of that in his writings, as we'll see. We see some of that in this story of barn burning. But Faulkner's literary style, he uses a lot of different techniques and stuff. We're on his literary works. Faulkner wrote several different series of books. Barn burning is just a short story, and it actually introduces a line of characters, the Snopeses, who show up in a lot of later books, and there's a trilogy that he writes that surround the Snopeses in particular. Not all, but most of Faulkner's books are somehow connected to one another, either by the characters or most often by the setting, which is a fictional Yoknapatawpha County in Mississippi. That's the best pronunciation I can give you on that. He even had a map that he drew of this fictional county, and so a lot of the towns and the people and things recur throughout different books, and he's just really building this larger setting, if you will, through his writings and stuff. And the topics that Faulkner wrote about cover a wide range, but they were all issues that early 1900s America in the South was dealing with. A lot of them were race, class issues, poverty, things like that. And though he doesn't really address them specifically, he lets them play themselves out through the characters, and we get to see that. It's kind of neat how he does that. So now we're to his literary style. He uses a lot of imagery in his writings. In barn burning, he adds so many details that it's not hard for the reader to really just build the scene in their own heads, and it's almost as if you were there with the characters and what's going on. It's really cool how he did that. I'm a visual guy, so that really helps me when I'm reading something. It gives me something to think about and adds a lot of color to the details of the story, and you get a better idea of the context and stuff. He also used a lot of long run-on sentences to carry complex thoughts. His grammar was a little bit odd, I guess you could say, and he uses a lot of dialogue, but it's not clear a lot of times who's actually speaking. Um, I know in barn burning, it took me a little while to figure out what was going on because it doesn't specifically say who's talking about what when it's going on. And so you kind of have to figure these things out as the story develops. Um, and one of the prominent focuses of Faulkner was his sense of despair at what human beings could, had, and might do to each other. So think World War II, World War One, World War Two. A lot of stuff was going on, and Faulkner recognized just the depravity of man, and he saw a lot of brokenness in the world, and he wrote about these things. He developed characters and stories that revolved around the issues that come from sin, basically. Though we'll get to it in a minute. We don't really see anything specifically or inherently Christian or even religious from Faulkner. So let's look at barn burning. This is the story that's in our book here, and this story follows a poor white family, the Snopeses, and the setting, the time frame is in the late 1800s. We get that because of some references. He talks about one of the characters' father was in the Civil War, and so you can kind of date that going forward and figure out when this is. So the father, he's a poor tenant farmer. Uh, you can tell that they don't really have anything. They're renting their house and paying for it by the crops that he's going to grow for the farmer who has hired him. And there's the issue of slavery going on here, though we don't really see slaves. You know, slavery has been abolished at this time, but there's still a lot of racial tensions and prejudice and a lot of different things going on. And you can see the as the story develops, the Abner Snopes, the father here in the story, he is not very fond of his own situation. He thinks he is entitled to something, and he's really sour and ill because of that. And he even treats everyone really bad. He treats the black servants in the story really bad, and he treats the rich white people really bad in the story. It's kind of this weird place that he finds himself in. But as I said earlier, the characters take some time to develop. It's not real clear who's speaking and who's actually getting in trouble or who's done what. But as the story unfolds, you begin to understand the relationship between the characters and see who's who and what's going on here. And so, again, the setting is in the late 1800s in this fictional county in Mississippi, and he uses this for a lot of his writings. And so the main characters here are a little boy named Colonel Sartorius Snopes, and he's called Sardy for short. And the next prominent figure is the father, Abner Snopes. Some of the other ones we see are the mother, Lenny Snopes, a wealthy guy that hires him, Major Despain, and Sardy's sisters and his brother. It's not clear. Like I said, it takes some time for these characters to develop as we move through the story. So in barn burning, it's following this poor tenant farmer family. Abner Snopes, the father, it becomes clear that he has a history of burning people's barns. He's downtrodden. He thinks he's been dealt an unfair hand, and he just moves from place to place to place, getting in trouble with the ones who has hired him, getting in trouble with other things, and whenever he leaves, we see that he burns their barns down. And I mean, that's bad enough today, but you imagine back then burning someone's barn down that held their livestock and their crops and all their livelihood basically in a farming community. So he does some serious damage to the ones who he thinks have wronged him. He's just this angry man, and he takes out his anger on his family physically, and he even gets into some altercations with some of the ones who have wronged him in his eyes. And so the story opens up in a courtroom scene of sorts, and then it moves from there. He gets kicked out of whatever town he was in, and he moves on to the next, and he's hired again, and I mean immediately he's in an altercation with the guy who has hired him, and gets in a big big squabble with him. But the young boy Sardi, he is loyal to his father. You know, he loves his dad and his family, and he wants his family to be there for him. But he's also seeing that his dad's in the wrong. That his dad is doing all these evil things, and he's just torn between this. And that becomes more and more evident as the story goes on. And eventually, at the end of the story, Sardi decides that he needs to do what's right, and he really goes to this wealthy farmer that's hired his father and tells him that his dad's going down there to burn his barn. And it ends up being a decision that gets his dad killed, and Sardi runs away and leaves, which you see him later on in some of other Faulkner's books. But it's really a sad ending to the story. It kind of has a hopeful glimmer to it for Sardi, but you know, the dad ends up getting shot, and the barn is on fire, and it's just really a sad story. But there are no really explicit biblical connections in this story. There's no religious references, but we do see some themes that the Bible talks about. You know, we see the depravity of man is a big one, but we also see, you know, within Sardi, the young boy, he is torn between what's right and what's wrong. And in Jeremiah 17:9, we read that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? And implying that God is the only one who can understand and discern our hearts and our intentions and our motives. And so Sardi's wrestling with this in this story, and he eventually does the right thing, but he's just so entrapped in this broken world that it is a costly decision that he has to make, but it would have been equally as costly if he had made the other decision. And so we see this man, the father Abner, and how bitter he is towards the world and ill and hateful. And in Romans 1:19-20, it says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse." And you know, maybe this father in the story has been dealt a bad hand, if you will. Maybe he's been wronged a lot in the past, but he is seeking some kind of contentment or satisfaction in all the wrong places. And Scripture is clear that we as human beings, being made in the image of God, have been given a moral compass that's written on our hearts, to have at least an inclination towards what's right and wrong. But that's not enough, and we are given the word that we can seek out God and that we can know Him. And unfortunately, in this story, we don't see that happen with this family. And then another one that really made me think about this was Colossians 3:23-24. It says, "Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ." And so this man was working for money, trying to get by, and you know, he was not content, obviously. And we often, as people, can get in that mindset. I know I've worked a job in the past before, and I hated it. I had a terrible boss. I didn't really like what I was doing at the time, and this is a verse that really kind of gave me the motivation on a day-to-day basis. You know, understanding that the Lord has us where we are for a purpose. It may not be very pleasant at the time, but we must keep our eyes open for opportunities to serve the Lord, and we must understand that He is Lord of all, and He knows things that we just can't understand. And so we must trust in Him in all situations. And this story of barn burning is it plays out very, very well what happens when you don't do these things that we read about in Scripture, when you don't trust in the Lord, when you don't seek the Lord. And it's a sad story, really, and it shows the deceitfulness of man and the brokenness of this world. So this is my citations, my bibliography slide, and I thank you for listening to me. Bye.